Right. Thanks, Rita. Yeah, my job is to give you an overview and then get the remarks going to this panel. This is an unbelievable panel with respect to cybersecurity. Just a couple of quick remarks. The main credential I think that I have in sitting up here is that I've been on the wrong end of a security breach. And if anyone has been there, you realize very, very quickly how sophisticated an attack can be. You realize how difficult it is to detect it. You realize how difficult the forensics are, and you realize how impactful it can be to a community, to people, and so forth going forward. And so that actually is, I think, the real reason for being here. And when we take a look at manufacturing, there's a lot of serious things to take a look at with where manufacturing is going and the way the world is going. I expect that all of us can agree that cybersecurity in manufacturing is pretty important, right? Everyone kind of gets an understanding that it's got control systems, and if someone hijacks those, you can take control of something and you can do some damage. You can affect the environment, you can do some safety things. Fortunately, there hasn't been any big things like that in the U.S. You can hijack and damage products. You know, so the Homeland Security piece comes into play very, very strongly here. Products can be damaged and can be compromised. Intellectual property can be stolen. I know when I look at manufacturing, you know, it's a third of the energy that's being used in the U.S. So what happens with manufacturing, the cybersecurity plays into that in a lot of ways. So one of the things that I think has been most interesting in working on this particular exercise is the focus in on manufacturing, because it does have a lot of ramifications for what we're doing in the U.S. and for us as, you know, a society in the U.S. and the world, if you will. Obviously, cybersecurity is receiving a lot of attention as well. So lots of attention with vehicles. You know, they're becoming major computers in their own right. Driverless vehicles, baby monitors, Equifax in the news. I just saw a new attack this morning. Just attacking how do you set up your PC, and a whole new attack was being distributed that way. So this is actually upon us day in and day out as we take this on. So the real question here with this particular workshop was to kind of get at this from a manufacturing standpoint. The group for the workshop was actually pretty interesting. For those of us who have dealt with security day in and day out, there actually was not, from my perspective, any new news. But what the report actually did do was kind of really bring to the forefront the conundrums that we're facing from a security standpoint and start laying out how can you start attacking those. I'd like to kind of give you an overview of those going forward. It was quite a robust group, you know, in the sense of bringing academia, government, commercial, provider, practitioner, defense, all of those particular stakeholders together, because that actually presented a pretty unique view within that manufacturing segment. One of the things when you dive into the report, you'll see a little bit of a deeper dive on a few things, and I'll just highlight these very, very quickly. One is manufacturing is made up of small, medium, and large companies, with the vast majority of them being small companies, small and medium companies. And if you think about ransomware attacks, the group that is most prime for a ransomware attack is a small company, small and medium companies going forward. One of the things that we kept finding over and over again is we kept hearing there hasn't been any known reported attacks in the U.S. But when we kind of said, is that true? What kind of kept coming back is, yeah, we've been attacked. Yeah, there's been damage. Yeah, there's been costs. But we don't feel comfortable reporting it. So we believe that there's a lot of unreported incidents out there going forward, even though you'll see in the public literature that there's been no known attacks in the U.S. If you look at the data that's coming through different providers, Symantec, IBM, and so forth, we dug into some detail, many thanks to Tom on this one. But you'll see that control systems do have vulnerabilities. Those are being tracked on a day-to-day basis. You'll see that our particular industries are being attacked, with automotive being the highest right now, microelectronics, chemical, food, kind of running down the list going forward. And the data is actually quite striking when you look at it. There are real vulnerabilities out there. If you pull up the covers a little bit more, it gets really interesting. So let's think about insurance. Insurance companies don't know what to do with cybersecurity. So where do we go with this? There's not enough known to really understand the risk with it. There's not enough reported to calculate that risk. So how do we get at that? So cybersecurity is relatively unexplored. One of the questions that was raised is, well, what happens if a manufacturer has an attack and someone's injured? Where does that responsibility lie, and what's the role of the cybersecurity piece of this going forward? That's an unanswered kind of question with respect to liability insurance, safety, and so forth. When we talk to small, medium, and in a lot of cases the large companies, it's literally overwhelming. There's so many products out there, there's so many possibilities, so many reports, so many workshops, and so forth. Where do you start? What can you do? What's the risk right now, and so forth. And the other thing is simply misconception. What's the reality out there? There's a lot of misinformation on this, such that it kind of is a barrier to even taking steps forward. We heard a whole lot of, it's not my problem. It's happening to Target. It's happening to Equifax. That's not manufacturing, so it's not us. Or it's happening overseas, so it's not us. And so there's a lot of inaction going forward. And one of the most striking things that we found is if one starts putting security into the products that are used in manufacturing, they don't sell. So there's actually a whole market incentive piece here that one has to raise some questions on. So these are the sorts of things that that set the stage for this report. And you can see that we're getting out of just purely the technology kinds of things and very much into the overall holistic view of where things go. What I thought I might do is take about 3 minutes, excuse me, and just give you a concrete example that I'm guessing that most people can relate to even as of this morning. I like this example. It's basically about Cheerios. And if you had your bowl of Cheerios this morning, you know that little circle O has about the right size. It tastes about the same as it always does. But what you also, when you think about it, should know that that little Cheerio doesn't have bacterial problems with it. Doesn't have pesticides on it. It doesn't have metals in it. And now when you buy it from General Mills, you can buy it as non-GMO and you can buy it as gluten-free. So how do you make sure all of that has happened when you take that bite of Cheerio? If you backtrack on this, and I'll just kind of highlight this very quickly, that box of Cheerios on the grocery store somewhere along the line was sitting in a distribution center, and you'd better have the data right on that box of Cheerios when it got there and when it left, because if it sits in that distribution center, the longer it sits there, the higher the risk of contamination just sitting in storage someplace. When it got to where it got from the distribution center, it came from a manufacturing plant. The one I'm thinking of is in Minneapolis. We toured it, and just exactly what you'd expect. It's filled with cooking, heating, blending, mixing, basically recipe management machines. But each one of those machines had to be sterilized appropriately, meet certain conditions before you started that process. Each one of those had to be adjusted to how do I mix the right ingredients, just like you're cooking at home. And you had to make sure that this Cheerio came out of that with none of the contaminants coming forward. And then if you go farther into the supply chain side of this, an oat is not an oat is not an oat. They come from all over the country. In this particular case, 3,000 to 5,000 grain elevators to farms. They all taste differently. You have to blend them in different ways with different recipes to get to the right ingredients. And again, you have to have certain kinds of oats to be gluten-free. You have to have certain kinds of oats that have to be grown in different ways. All of those have data associated with them, and that data is tracked from a farm to a train car to a grain elevator to the manufacturing plant, to the distribution center. So if you think about it from a cybersecurity standpoint, and I'm in no way, General Mills does a very good job, so I'm not suggesting they're vulnerable here. So don't go that direction. It's just a good example. But if you think about the data that needs to be tracked at any one of those places, if that data is compromised in some way, you can end up with that Cheerio not being what you want and having some things in it that you don't want. And that actually has happened with food products, as we all well know. So it's a good example for where you want to take a hard look at cybersecurity. So let me just kind of end my overview of this. You have a copy of the report in front of you. And what I wanted to do just to is highlight 6 conundrums that are kind of in that report. They're not listed quite like this, so you can kind of treat this as reading between the lines. But this is the basis that drove towards these recommendations. Number 1 is technology does not solve security. Technology is an important ingredient in security. Actually, strategy is important. And you actually have to worry about culture, organization, education, and the technology altogether. And there's a whole lot that needs to be known about a particular plant site and so forth for the security to even work. So it's not just technology. And there's a lot of I call it misconception out there, misperception, that I can solve my problems with technology, and that is not the case. The second is, which I tried to illustrate with the Cheerios example, is that all of manufacturing right now is moving in a direction of connecting themselves. So we call this a supply chain or a value chain. But the benefits, the competitive advantages, these sorts of things that are very much on the forefront of manufacturing today all involve connecting each other with data. And then obviously connecting each other with the products as they move through different steps in the manufacturing process. If you think about this, what we have to do is take a control system, we have to connect it to another control system through the network. We take that combination, we connect it to other parts of the factory. And then what you do is you take that factory and you connect it to another factory. And then you take that factory and you connect it to a whole supply chain, and all of a sudden you've got all these nested, using the NIST term, cyberspaces that are interconnected, and each one of those interfaces is a vulnerability. And so one of the things this report really goes after is the interface of connecting companies and operations, unit operations, and control systems, because that's actually a major vulnerability that we are now facing with the directions that manufacturing is going. A third thing is under the heading of legacy. Manufacturing is in the category of long horizon facilities. So there's facilities out there that have been running for 50 years, 25 years, 30 years, and we have to worry about cybersecurity and this connectivity with those kinds of facilities. A lot of the data stuff is really old because it's still useful, still serviceable, and you need to get that connected right. So how do you do this? We can estimate about 30,000 independent software applications in industry right now, and if you start connecting these things to get at the overall kinds of things we're talking about, the Cheerios example, you start patching and stitching things together into unmanageable complexity. So we have to do some things in some different ways. So how do you patch and stitch these things together with new infrastructure, new ways that actually accommodate the security up front and in a design fashion? A fourth thing, which I alluded to already, is the market itself. The market, if you secure products or you secure a control system, on a product-by-product basis, you have not solved the security problem. That's the first thing. And so you have to ask, does the market actually drive us towards, when we interconnect these kinds of systems, does it solve the security problem? And it doesn't. There needs to be a different kind of value proposition put together so that the incentives work. And when you talk across the commercial industry, there's actually room to do some regulated kinds of things in some industries. Defense is an example, food is an example, but by and large, you need the market to do this. So how do we get a new value proposition and align security with some of the productivity and economic capabilities that will drive the competitiveness? That's an unresolved question. And then the third thing, or I'm sorry, the fifth thing is data and parts. There has been so much talked about with security around the parts or the materials that are manufactured. That is important, but also important is the data about those parts and the data about the facilities in which those parts or materials were manufactured. The two go hand in hand, and so you actually have to think about cyber and physical together from a security standpoint. And then the very last thing, which is the sixth one, is there's a whole current and future aspect to this. We can't just not do anything with respect to security, even in the current environment. You have to do something. There's a lot of technology, a lot of organizational experience, a lot of educational capability out there, but it's very, very fragmented. How can you bring it together and get going now? But you also need to look to the future, because the future of this connectivity is virtualization, just like we're experiencing in the financial end of things or the consumer end of things. The same thing is happening with manufacturing. As virtualization takes place, you actually get new opportunities and new ways of doing and dealing with security. We got to get to those, but you also have to get started now. So bridging current and future going forward. So 6 is probably too many to even talk about, but 6 it is. But I hope you get a flavor for these. But all of the recommendations, and you'll see them summarized in there, and we can now dive into them a little bit more. Number 1 is public-private partnership, because when you start connecting supply chains, there needs to be a third-party entity somewhere, somehow. And our discussions took us around the path of some form of public-private partnership. There's more detail to this one, but we can talk this one through. But you have to have a trusted third party involved in this somewhere. A natural outgrowth of this is an Information Security Advisory Committee. Other industries have trusted ways in which companies can share breaches, attacks, attack vectors, and solutions in real time, do this very quickly. Manufacturing is pretty fragmented. So one of the first things we think should be done is to get this third-party involvement and get this ISAC created and underway as quickly as possible. We believe that there is value in an executive work group or a CEO work group of some sort to basically have a concerted voice from industry to drive this market value, the culture, the way the industry should be looking at this. We need some further, direction and voice, if you will, from industry itself, and that's what I'm trying to create. And then in this current and future thing, there's so much capacity in academics, the agencies, the national labs, the resources. How can we start harnessing those for current activities, current needs, as well as these future needs that I was just talking about? And so creating some of the federal activities that will get at these and align the capabilities that exist now with the research, current and future, is, we think, a very possible and almost a necessary thing to do. So those recommendations there, we'll drill down on those. I'm just giving you a high-level view of those. But if you walk away with, if you leave the meeting with a view of Cheerios all the way to the farm, I will have been successful. If you leave it with a view of we're now interconnecting all kinds of cyberspaces with physical facilities, every time you connect something, you have an interface, which is a vulnerability. And if you leave with a current, we need to get going now, and there's a lot of opportunity to deal with cybersecurity if we start getting our resources aligned. If you walk away with those 3 things from what I'm saying, I will have been successful, and then the rest of the panel here can take it from here. But I appreciate your attention and your reading the report. I hope this comes through when you read it.
Thanks, Jim, for the excellent overview. And I just honestly tell you that next time I eat breakfast serious, I'll think about it now that he's spoke that enough. I'm sure you all think about cybersecurity next time. With that, there are all the details on the report, and then you can see how to download the report instructions on our website. With that, I want to introduce to you Michael Russo. He is the Director and Corporate Lead for Global Founders, and also is the Chairman of the Executive Committee for MForesight. So Mike will introduce the panel and moderate the panel. So thanks, Shadar.
Thanks, Shadar, and thanks to the House Manufacturing Caucus once again. Just really quickly, kind of how we arrived here today. Last year, as we began to really dig in deep and engage stakeholders to a much greater level throughout the manufacturing community, we became aware through the input of others that there was a gap as related to cybersecurity in manufacturing. And there was, as we asked questions to those that are working in the space, a lot of great work going on, a lot of people working on technologies, a lot of people admiring the problem, but the bottom line is that there was no real central focal point on how to address cybersecurity in manufacturing. And I can tell you from my day job at Global Foundries, we, as the nation's largest pure play and really only pure play contract semiconductor chip maker, and so we are a big supplier to the Department of Defense, we're keenly aware of risks and are constantly working every day to address those, address the needs. We work very closely with the supply chains. We decided to undertake a body of work to really engage the stakeholders in more detail to figure out what the needs were, and in fact, if there are gaps, where are they and how we could address them. So that led to a workshop in March, a 2-day workshop. We passionately call it our Snow In. It snowed that day, so the folks in D.C., the people traveling in, we just had them come in a day early and not a problem, but the folks from D.C. couldn't move. We said, why don't we have a pajama party, come in early and we'll get you some hotel rooms. So it was pretty well attended, actually. But this body of work represents the input from all the stakeholders in academia, industry, and government, as well as subsequent discussions that we had over a period of the next few months. So thank you to all those who participated. Thanks to those, you see the names of the participants and those that contributed in the report. But now to where we are today, to continue the discussion, I was looking at the folks on the panel in their bios, and some of which I know pretty well. But this is a pretty impressive group of people to be talking about this subject. You talk about being well-rounded. It's a shame we couldn't spend more than just a little bit of time here, but I can assure you that the discussion won't stop here. So if they told you we're signing up for like 30 minutes or an hour, I'm sorry about that. It was a little bit of a miscommunication there. So I'm going to do some quick intros, and then we'll dive in. And let's not look at this as a panel discussion. I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to share their perspective on the topic from the seat that they're in, but then let's really spend half of the time dedicated to really open discussions and Q&A. So that's the type of format and discussion that I think is most appropriate here. So first of all, to start off with Dave Vasco, who is our colleague on our Leadership Council at MForesight. He is the Director of Advanced Technology Strategic Development at Rockwell Automation, and he's responsible for applied R&D and global product standards and regulations, developing and managing technology for the next generation of industrial automation products. And Dave's a member of our Leadership Council, as I said, and a NIST Visiting Committee on Advanced Technology, as well as other groups focused on smart manufacturing and Industry 4.0. So think about Rockwell in the space of industry automation. Couldn't have a more appropriate participant today. Secondly, let's thank Dr. Carol Hawk, and she is a program manager for cybersecurity for the energy delivery systems in the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability at DOE. And Carol's programs include the National SCADA Test Bed, the Trustworthy Cyber Infrastructure for the Power Grid Center in Industry, and research and academic-directed programs to increase the resilience of energy delivery infrastructure. And if you think about think about Department of Energy and specifically Carol's work in addressing cybersecurity as related to grid and energy delivery systems, there's a lot to learn and a lot that we can really work on together when it comes to manufacturing. And third on the list, Mike McGrath. Many of you know Mike. He's currently a principal consultant at McGrath Analytics. He recently led a study for the National Defense Industrial Association on cybersecurity for advanced manufacturing. Mike's a former DARPA program manager and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for R&D, for RDT&E, Test and Evaluation, and former Vice President at Answer. Mike served on the Defense Science Board and the NRC's Material and Manufacturing Board, and is currently a member of the NRC's Board on Army Science and Technology and the advisory board of the Georgia Tech Manufacturing Institute. Well-rounded DoD perspective, more broad DoD perspective, and actually leveraged that in the consultant world. So that's the first for anyone, right? But we're very glad to have Mike, our friend, here today. Today we have Donna Dodson, Donna Dodson, who has, we've actually given an advanced briefing to NIST. Just got done, so you have the inside line. We've spent a couple hours with you already, Donna. Donna is an Associate Director and Chief Cybersecurity Advisor of the Information Technology Lab at NIST, and Donna is also Director of NIST's National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. And Donna oversees NIST's cybersecurity program, collaborating with industry, academia, and government agencies in all aspects of cybersecurity research, testing, awareness, and outreach. So when I mentioned some of the great work being done on technology development and looking at things from a technology perspective, Donna kind of wears that pin proudly. I also like to say that Donna was named one of CyberScoop's 2017 top women in cybersecurity. So we're really happy to have you today. But again, it's not over today, Donna. Thank you. And last but absolutely not least is Melinda Woods, who is the Director of the Defense Production Act and Title III program within the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy. In this role, Melinda ensures timely availability of essential domestic industrial resources to support national defense and homeland security. I've had the pleasure of working with Melinda on multiple fronts for a period of time, and I can assure you that you can have a better person looking after making sure the U.S. supply chain meets the needs of our warfighters. So, again, from a DoD perspective and a broader supply chain perspective, Melinda, thank you for sharing your time with us today. So, with that, spend about 5 minutes apiece kind of sharing your perspectives, and then we'll get into Q&A. So first of all, Dave, looking at it from your kind of bird's eye view on the importance of cybersecurity and addressing risks associated with cybersecurity in industry and manufacturing, what can you share with us in 5 minutes? That's not a lot of time to share that now, is it? 5 minutes. We'll see how good Dave is.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So industry now is going through a digital transformation. We're adopting cyber-physical systems, smart manufacturing. We are bridging the divide between operational technology, these are the assets on the factory floor, and information technology. And doing so is creating vulnerabilities. As Jim mentioned, each one of these interfaces creates vulnerabilities along the way. Now, as we connect our supply chain and our demand chain and our design chains together, we're actually creating multi-organizational ecosystems. And those ecosystems are only as strong as their weakest link. Many of the organizations in the ecosystems can be small and medium manufacturers. Many of them don't even have a security person on staff. They can't afford it. So there's the challenge there. But to be competitive, the U.S. has to charge ahead with smart manufacturing, with connecting our enterprises. We have no choice. That's going to be the future of productivity. We need to go there. So how do we solve this? We really need to work on the risks, to jointly share the development of the technology, the R&D, working on the technology measures we could take to counteract these threats. We need to share an awareness of the threats that are there. To be successful, we need industry, working with academia, working with the government in order to be able to provide this information and to share it. We need to harmonize our standards. So right now, within the International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC, there's a fantastic standard around cybersecurity for manufacturing, 62443. But we also have other competitive efforts. There's one in UL for 2900. There's a common criteria. There's efforts, TC260 in China that are emerging. For many manufacturers, implementing, testing, certifying to one of these standards is a big hurdle. Trying to resolve all four is much harder. And it's great that we have all these smart people looking at different aspects, but we need to harmonize those to ensure we have a common way of looking at this, common requirements, so that we can actually achieve a common result and we could actually implement something in a timely manner. When you bring in things like IT security as well, as you think about a supply chain, you're constantly going back and forth. You may be going from operational technology zones to IT, back to OT, and back to IT, all through the supply chain, the same thing. We need to resolve those aspects and harmonize those aspects from the IT as well. So part of this is getting the requirements, common approaches. The other is the policy management. You think about it, you have multiple vendors coming into a factory and many people coming in there, maybe some working full-time, maybe some contractors, trying to come up with authentication systems that are easy to use, that can be applied and be productive. That's going to be the key to actually making cybersecurity work in real environments. So I think the report has had some remarkable recommendations. I encourage you to read it. And I think the key element for me is really this cooperation, having the industry, the government, academia work together to share this information going forward. And I think through that we can actually succeed.
Thanks, Dave. So, Carol, looking at cybersecurity as related to manufacturers and potentially similarities with what you're dealing with related to the grid and energy delivery, are there some ways that we can leverage your learnings, and what are some of the similarities from your perspective? And there's also the piece on the role of energy and electricity energy as related to manufacturing today. Some of the sensitivities related to quality, reliability, but cybersecurity. So there's a direct play as well. But from your perspective, what can we learn? What should we look at?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks, Dave. And I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been said in terms of, yes, there are absolutely similarities within the critical energy infrastructure in our cybersecurity challenges as those that have been highlighted in the manufacturing report. And in my office, the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability within the Department of Energy, or OE, has been working cybersecurity for the energy sector for well over a decade now. And Dave, what you were talking about in terms of partnerships, we live and die by partnerships. It is critical to partner with the energy sector. So we build public-private partnerships, so in terms of commonalities, this is a very foundational one. We have a program called the Cybersecurity for Energy Delivery Systems program. There's two primary aspects of that. One is building operational capability throughout the sector, so using existing tools and technologies that we have available today to help build capacity in the sector to do things such as information sharing. And that was one of the topics that came up in the report, thinking about an ISAC, or Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which for the energy sector we have one that works very effectively. It's a great idea. So that's one example of building operational capacity within the sector. And then we have a research and development part of the program, and that's what I manage. And we're developing new capabilities, so new tools and technologies with a focus on allowing these critical energy infrastructure, and I mean both the electric power grid as well as the production, refining, and transmission of oil and natural gas. So when I say energy, I am being all-inclusive. So with the research and development part of it, we're developing new technologies that would allow the control systems that, and this is the operational technology that's been brought into the discussion, that would allow the control systems that manage, monitor, protect, and control the physical process of energy delivery to allow those systems to survive a cyber incident. And that word survive is key. So we do our best to protect, keep the adversary out. Should the adversary get in, then we will be able to adapt and survive while sustaining critical functions. And that is the vision of a roadmap that we worked together with the energy sector to create about a decade ago. And those partnerships are critical. So David, that I think was one of your foundational messages. And Jim, the point that you made about it's not just technology, it's also people, it's processes, all working together. It's an ecosystem, really, in order to achieve the, to be able to take the community to the place where we can survive an incident, and through these partnerships. So commonalities, absolutely, it's through partnerships. And, in my case, what I do is I build public-private partnerships within the R&D, research and development domain. And it's about recognizing that operational technology is in some very important ways a different thing than information technology. So the systems that control physical processes have different requirements than the systems that sit on your desk and handle your email and your word processing. And so the differences between those two domains need to be carefully understood when you're developing cybersecurity approaches to protecting the operational technology or those control systems. So there's several basic messages, but partnership, absolutely critical. Recognizing that it's an ecosystem of technologies as well as processes and people all working together, that's also absolutely critical. And then focusing on survival, focusing on having these control systems be able to adapt and survive so that we can keep the lights on regardless, while we're detecting, isolating, and removing a cyber incident from the system.
Thank you very much, Carol. Okay. Mike, from your perspective, again, you've worn multiple hats, but a strong Department of Defense focus, obviously, throughout your career. Looking at it from that Department of Defense perspective, what can you share that might help us kick off this discussion and items that we should be aware of?
Well, since we have Melinda on the panel, I'm not going to speak for DOD, but I will share some perspectives from NDIA, the National Defense Industrial Association. And by way of background, we all read front-page articles in 2013 about cyber espionage that had exfiltrated technical data on 24 frontline weapon systems in DOD. And by the time those articles appeared, DOD and the defense industries were well at work tightening up cybersecurity in IT systems that handle that technical data. As a member of NDIA's manufacturing division, I looked at the digital thread, that technical product and process data, flowing all the way down to the shop floor. And the question was, is the shop floor going to become part of the attack surface? And so we formed a joint working group with the cyber division. We had to educate one another because neither one knew anything about the other's business. We issued a report in 2014 that highlighted the differences between IT and operations technology, OT, in manufacturing, which includes some of what Carol just discussed in difference between cyber-physical, ICS control, and IT, but now in the context of manufacturing operations, and particularly in supply chains with small manufacturers. So that was the perspective I brought to the workshop. And so I would say there are three important differences between defense needs and commercial needs in this area. The first is the threats. The biggest threat for commercial enterprises is cyber criminals and organized crime. There are relatively few companies who are of interest to national level threats, but anybody who's making money is a target for cyber criminals. And they're good at what they do. And so commercial firms need to raise the bar high enough to deter or defeat world-class high jumpers. DoD is contending with world-class pole vaulters. And so we're talking about nation-state adversaries who have targeted manufacturing companies for espionage purposes or for sabotage purposes. And so it's a different level of protection, and we need to think about it a little differently than just the economic terms that a company would apply in deciding how much protection is enough. Second difference is in the objectives and values of what you're trying to protect or what the consequences of an attack could be. So both defense and commercial firms look at what the IT cyber community calls CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability of information and of networks. From a commercial standpoint, that's an economic value computation. So if the confidentiality is breached and personal identification information is leaked or valuable intellectual property is compromised, they can put a value on that. Defense has to look not only at the cost impact, but also at the national security impact. And so the consequences is arguably larger. Commercial firms look at integrity of the information because, particularly in cyber physical systems, if you change the information, you change the output of the physical system. And again, they can value the integrity of the data. And so if you're making Cheerios, then anywhere along that chain, if the data loses its integrity, your product is at risk. In defense, we're worried that a nation-state adversary is sophisticated enough to change the data and introduce a malicious defect in the part, maybe even an exploitable defect that could be triggered later at the time of the adversary's choosing, a kill switch. And there's a recent Defense Science Board report on the cyber supply chain that points out the importance of that area. It's something that DoD is now focused on in its weapon systems, and it wants to track the provenance of the parts all the way back to the source, just like the Cheerios all the way back to the farm. We have more in common with General Mills than we might think. The third difference is in the mitigation approach. The commercial approach is to use the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a really well-structured way of thinking your way through the problem space, making trade-off decisions, and deciding where to apply investments, where to make changes. And you can do that, again, from an economic standpoint, and it's a voluntary compliance regime. Defense has decided that voluntary compliance is not sufficient for national security purposes, and so it's now a contractual compliance issue. There is a DFARS clause, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, on safeguarding covered defense information and cyber incident reporting. And it used the NIST way of thinking, but the Department of Defense went through that calculus to decide how much is enough, and they specified some minimum level of protection, pointing to a NIST publication called 800-171 that has 110 cybersecurity controls that are the minimum for protecting covered defense information. That is now mandatory in new contracts. It flows down selectively in the supply chain to small suppliers. It requires prompt reporting when there's a breach. And it's frankly IT-oriented because a lot of the adaptation of those controls to the OT environment in manufacturing is still work in progress. And so defense industry, the big companies, I think, along with DoD, have tightened things up considerably, but they're worried about the smaller companies in their supply chains and would like to work with DoD and the rest of government on solutions in this space. How do we address the OT problem? And there is a follow-on NDIA study in progress. It's wrapping up its recommendations. Those recommendations are similar to what came out of the MForesight workshop. And I really compliment MForesight on a great report here. And so we're hoping that between this report and what they hear from NDIA, that we will see DoD take a leadership role in some of these areas because arguably they've got more at stake than most other agencies.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, Donna, looking at the great work that your organization has done and continues to do in this space, and obviously we had a great seed discussion here just this week. Could you share your perspective on the space in general and the importance and really the role of this work as related to what you're doing?
Sure. So, like the others, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to be here and MForesight for the great work that they've done with this report. It's really an exciting time in the nation right now. And sometimes when we think or when we're at cybersecurity conferences, you can kind of come away and say, oh, wow, this is daunting and overwhelming and gosh, I can't do anything. And I don't think that's the case at all. And I think with the actions that you lay out and the recommendations that you lay out here is a tremendous opportunity for the manufacturing sector to be able to come together and make strong security good business, and good business relying on strong security. I've spent a long time in the cybersecurity space, and sometimes we look at the problem from strictly a cybersecurity perspective, and I joke sometimes when you get you get some cybersecurity folks in the room, they can talk for hours and hours and hours about the best kinds of technologies and capabilities to put in place. But in reality, these are business challenges, and looking at them from that business perspective and that perspective of resiliency is critically important. And I think that's where the things like public-private partnerships come together. I think earlier one of the insights that the report brings out is that technology does not solve security challenges, cybersecurity challenges. It's really about people, it's about process, it's about education and technology, and bringing all of those together. So our work with building the framework for critical infrastructure cybersecurity really focused on that. And it wasn't, sometimes it's lovingly referred to as the NIST cybersecurity framework, but it really isn't the NIST cybersecurity framework. It really was a public-private partnership that brought that together from many communities, including the manufacturing community. And it recognizes that we all have a part to play here. And there are tremendous interdependencies between organizations in this space and within organizations. So first of all, as we think about it being a business challenge, we think about that from the C-suite all the way to the bits and bytes folks. And the framework was designed as a way to help have those conversations within organizations and between organizations at these different levels. basing the work on standards and best practices so that you can have that cybersecurity posture. So you have a lexicon to talk to, and you have a cybersecurity posture today and where you want to be in the future. And the NIST program in this space really brings to the table expertise from manufacturing and expertise in cybersecurity. So we've been able to take that framework and build a manufacturing profile that looks at not just the IT side, but very heavily on the operational technology side and the intersection between the two in terms of what standards are out there and best practices as a way to help organizations get started. Our manufacturing extension partnership has developed a small business manufacturing guide that's related to cybersecurity, a small business guide for cybersecurity, and is the cybersecurity for small business is for all small businesses. But remember, we talked about this being a business challenge, and in order for this to be successful, we have to talk in terms that business and organizations in these sectors understand. So the MEP work is able to build on that and to talk in terms that small and medium manufacturers can understand. And I think these kinds of incentives begin to focus people and get them started so that they can build on top. But I think the notion of bringing together executive leadership and having harness the capabilities of both the public and the private sectors to say, okay, from a manufacturing standpoint, not only do we have operational technology, we have IT technologies that we have to be concerned about, and we have the standards, best practices, tools, techniques, and measurements in these spaces, but there are some spaces where we all need to come together and work so that as a sector we can continue to improve. And from the supply chain standpoint, we have ways to talk between sectors so that if I am a manufacturer and I'm using 30% of the energy, right? You used it, did I hear that statistic earlier? That if I'm working and I need to be able to talk to folks in the energy sector as a supplier to me, I have that cross-dependency, I have those dialogues and those capabilities so that as a nation, we create a culture of cybersecurity in the same way that I believe manufacturing brought a culture of safety to the nation. This work, this effort, can really help us go a long way to bring that culture of cybersecurity to the nation. So again, I congratulate you, and I'm giving you back 20 seconds.
All right, Don. Thank you, Don. I won't spend it all in the same place. Your recognition of making sure that we speak the same language as the smaller manufacturers, and making sure that whatever we develop they're able to understand and contribute to and leverage is really important. Okay, Melinda, from your. I don't know how you sleep at night, but maybe you don't sleep at night. I'm assuming you sleep at night. But from making sure that our manufacturing industrial base meets the needs of the Department of Defense, which includes, if it's fraught with risk, that's not going to help you sleep at night, right? From your perspective, what do you see as greatest challenges? What do you think we should be focused on, and where do you think we're maybe pointing in the right direction, or we need to look elsewhere?
Thank you very much, Mike, for the opportunity. I'd like to thank you for allowing me to be on this esteemed panel, and particularly for letting Mike McGrath go before me. So I don't have to cover any of the kind of basic understanding of course, DoD is very, very interested and concerned, and you are too, quite frankly, even if you know it or not, in any weaponization or disruption to manufacturing processes and environments that affect us in many different ways. So thank you for that. So again, to your point, what I think, and Mike mentioned it, and other of the panel members mentioned it as well, that's key for me to discuss today is the connection that the department needs to have with equipping our industrial base to help us. So as we figure out what our requirements are, and we're working hard to do that, how do we help our industrial base get to where we need them to be? So for me right now, as a part of the manufacturing and industrial-based policy group in DoD, manufacturing and industrial-based policy is really kind of where it's at. So we're focusing on manufacturing, and I think we have a broad or kind of definitely a philosophical meeting of the minds as it relates to the importance of operational security, manufacturing security, but I don't know that we have, at least at the highest levels, the focus and targeted investments in the industrial base to help realize some of our requirements. And that's where programs like our manufacturing technology program that works today to help companies bring about manufacturing processes that we need to produce what we need, the DPA Title III program that puts in place capability and capacity in manufacturing environments can recognize the cybersecurity impacts, how that is national security. And in particular, one of the things that I know you and I have talked about and that fits quite well into the report that you've done is we can really, at least in DPA Title III, I can elevate the discussion of the industrial base shortfall in cybersecurity manufacturing as it relates to national security, really to a national level and help to form kind of the meeting of the minds at that level so that we can create the infrastructure and our investment and incentive programs to help the small and medium businesses that are within our supply chain to meet our requirements. That is going to be key. Of course, we deal in DoD with this issue of long horizon facilities that are, they've been in place for 50, 60 years that are falling apart. I mean, that's a very difficult problem, a very difficult nut to crack to infuse the necessary cybersecurity elements into those environments. So today we have, I think, a robust understanding of how to help those providers as it relates to getting new equipment, getting new buildings, right? But we really need to also consider cybersecurity as a part of that national security infrastructure that we're putting in place, that we're modernizing. And I think right now we're recognizing it in a lot of our programs, but we don't have a targeted strategy, investment strategy as it relates to cybersecurity for national security. We're getting there, but I think that's going to really help us to organize ourselves around how we incentivize and help the industrial base. Because in fact, DoD, we have the regulations in the government and DoD, we have the requirements, but we really effectuate everything we do through the industrial base. So while we're levying requirements, we also need to be figuring out how to properly incentivize, how to work with, partner with the industrial base to help us get where we all need to be. And I think that's really kind of the main focus in what I have to offer in this introduction.
Very good. So with that, as I said earlier, let's really focus on Q&A, take advantage of this esteemed panel, have a very broad perspective here as related to cybersecurity. So I'll open it up to questions. I see Dr. Wessner.
Yeah, thanks. This was really, I'm with Georgetown University, and I sort of like to ask two related questions. Your last point there was excellent with how to properly incentivize. We can work on patriotism, we can work on public-private partnerships. But I used to work in the Treasury, and I was wondering what sort of tax incentives might be deployed to try and accelerate this type of deployment. And if I may, Mike, I'd like to ask a related question. There's been a huge experiment just opened up for the Department of Defense to build resilient, up-to-date
On the tax incentive, we didn't have any tax people up here. But it's actually, Chuck, your point's well taken there. We actually, just over lunch, we were talking about the potential as tax reform moves forward and there's various components of tax-related discussions underway. Could there be a component of that helps to provide incentives to manufacturers to make that more of an economic discussion, right? So while I don't think, and panelists, you can jump in, I don't believe that anybody here is able to speak directly to taxes. I see I feel Mike McGrath's hand moving towards his button. Is that right, Mike?
Well, I just wanted to say that Melinda and I had some prior discussions several months ago with NDIA raising this question of what could we do to incentivize things. And we both know that DOD is not in charge of setting tax policy, so that wasn't within the span of control. But the new offerings from the industrial control system suppliers, like Rockwell Automation, are inherently more secure and have architectures that allow the kind of connectivity that Jim talked about that will increase productivity and efficiency in manufacturing. Unfortunately, most of the small manufacturers who have older equipment can't justify buying new equipment until their current stuff reaches end of life. And so the question is, what could you do to tip the balance? Is there some way DOD could partner with the industrial control system industry as they reach out to their customer base to somehow incentivize something that would be good not only for cybersecurity, but also in some sense would start to pay for itself in productivity gains? DOD back in history had a program called Industrial Modernization Incentives Program. It's just an existence proof that there are things DOD could act on if the right idea were on the table. And so I think we're looking for that right idea.
If I could offer a thought, and I'd like to pivot off exactly what you were saying, Mike, and Donna, you were saying something very similar in your introduction, is in terms of incentivizing. From my world, where we're developing new technologies, the sweet spot is where you're strengthening cybersecurity while you're providing a business case to use that technology. Okay, and that's how you get impact, and that's how you go nationwide. And through recognizing that, we've actually have my program is SEDS, right? Cybersecurity for Energy Delivery Systems. Some of the SEDS technologies have gone nationwide. They're being used in every state in the nation now, reducing the risk that energy delivery could be disrupted because of a cyber incident. The way you do that is that you respect the business case, right? And so if you can reduce the risk of a cyber incident disrupting energy delivery while you're making it easier to operate the system, reduce the resources required to operate the system, now you've got your impact, and now you can move that technology out the door, which is where we all want to be.
So during the development of the framework for critical infrastructure cybersecurity, there was actually some reports that were developed by Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, Energy and Defense, I believe, on the question of incentives. And frankly, it's been a harder conversation. And for each one of the framework workshops, we dedicated some time to this sort of question and also spent some time with the Department of Homeland Security was doing some work with the insurance industry as yet another mechanism to bring to the table to be able to look at incentives. So from that standpoint, I think the insurance market is just starting in this space, and the way we measure cybersecurity risk is still somewhat of a question. We are continuing to work on that across the federal government, specifically at NIST. The new version of framework 1.1 actually has some discussion of metrics that you use internally, but that's a continued work item for us as we think about that. And then I think also we need to do work to educate different kinds of consumers so that the consumer space is doing a job asking for that. And certainly with DOD's leadership, with the DIB, and other sectors across, other sector-specific agencies across the government working to incentivize these sorts of capabilities. So, you know, the work that HHS is doing, the work that FDA is doing, where really all sorts of cyber-physical systems are coming into the medical manufacturing in the medical world, and the incentives there will help. From the NIST perspective, we're working on our part, which again gets back to mostly to the technology. But Manufacturing Extension Partnership, for example, has provided some guidelines that small and medium-sized businesses can use to address the DFARS clause and the use of Special Publication 171. We have our National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, where we're putting out architectures and capabilities and showing people how they can use products and services off the shelf to meet their cybersecurity requirements. So I don't think in the area of incentives it'll be just one thing, but the whole of government, I think, has taken this question very, very seriously, and we're continuing to evolve our thoughts and ideas on what we can do to be better partners in this space.
Very, very good. How's that? Now, we didn't think we can get far with that tax question. Now, the one I'm going to challenge the group is on how do we leverage the wrath of nature? If we're going to have to do a lot of rebuilding, what can we do to kind of deploy some of these technologies and processes? So there's people shaking heads, yes, it makes sense, but and when you do, when you're called on, just give your name and affiliation. That would be helpful.
Sharon Flank, InfoTrack. We do chemical security through fingerprinting. I love the focus on cyber-physical security. I'm going to push you to think about the place of sensors in that picture. Starting with the Cheerios example, those sensors are capable of figuring out, oh, somebody let it get soggy, somebody let a rat in and didn't catch it. But really, sensors have the potential, as they get cheaper, to play an important role in that you don't have to worry about the weakest link. You can use the sensor data to tell you what's happened at the end. So if you don't trust the links along the way, or you can't get every enterprise to get rid of the stupid people or the evil people or the, oh, look, the security breach, we just set up a fake site and now everybody's credit reports are reporting to the fake site. You can get around that by relying on sensor input that will feed into the broader system. Comments?
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one and say yes. But more specifically, I'm coming at it from an institute standpoint. So the smart manufacturing actually is about the sensors, and this actually ties the other discussion together, because there's a whole lot you can do with the sensors. Just as you say, but also you can get the cost down, but you create the situation, right, where a sensor way downstream can be very important to something way upstream and vice versa. And so you now get into this space of how do you manage the business relationships across this with that kind of information and the management of a device relative to the information that's used here. There's a lot of capability, we believe, that allows one to manage that in very effective and new ways. So this is more that future thing I was talking about. So sensors, absolutely yes, and there's lots of different ways of sensing, and then putting the relationships together up and down the supply chain, as we're talking about today, that can apply in other places, gives a lot of new additional capability. And oh, by the way, you didn't mention that there's a sensor, and then there's lots of different ways to sense. right? And you can do all kinds of things with that, but more information that's used in a useful and knowledgeable way is really quite valuable. So I'm just making the point that when we look to the future, there's a lot of possibility and a lot of new opportunity from security, and to link security to economic benefit when we're thinking about incentives.
Okay, Mike?
You know, we've been looking at this as well from a defense industry standpoint, and one important consideration is that each sensor becomes a point of entry and part of the attack surface. So it's really important that the suppliers of sensors address cybersecurity and build it in from the outset, because you can't bolt it on later, which I'm sure you know, but.
And just to add, so in installing industrial systems, sensors are also a weak point as far as reliability. So typically when people install manufacturing systems, they try to have the least amount of sensors possible, because every one that fails can bring down the system. But as we evolve to more sophisticated cyber-physical systems, where we have systems that can diagnose themselves, it's possible then to take the optional sensors or sensors that are adding more data, determine their state, and have them pull off the system or not be part of the overall outcome if they are in a state that isn't viable. So that is, those sensors, those extra sensors, those more sophisticated sensors are becoming more viable as we progress with the technology.
And I'll just add one point. I agree with everything said. One of the things we're looking at in the microelectronics area is exactly this kind of philosophy and this approach. I am also sensitive to the economic element of maybe catching something at the very end. So from a DoD perspective, we typically are able to absorb costs such that if we just kind of have to throw something away, we can. But that may not be the most economical situation for a manufacturer. So we're happy to support whatever the working kind of implementation of the sensor network in the manufacturing environment. But I would think that there's also this element, which I think, Carol, you mentioned, because we look at that very hard as well, the economic business case for how you can sustain whatever solution that you're putting forward. So that's also a consideration. But we're looking at it in other facets as well.
Of cybersecurity is this whole idea of big data, and I just want you to comment on what is being done to train people to recognize big data.
So I can't speak to training people, but I can speak to training devices, if that's somewhere we can go with that comment. In some of the new technologies that we're developing, there's different applications that are used to run, for instance, the power grid. So things like contingency analysis that will look at a model of that grid, a physical model, and say, if we were to lose a large transmission line or lose a generator, would the grid remain stable, and how can we operate it to ensure that it remains stable, right? So contingency analysis, things like state estimation that also show how that grid will behave from a physical model perspective. So one of the technologies, one of the capabilities that I'm developing in my program is to ask the question, can we build into those power system applications the ability for them to realize that the data they're receiving to perform those calculations has been manipulated with malicious intent, which is a different thing than receiving data from a sensor that has started to malfunction, right? So to distinguish those two things and then to react accordingly, that if you see that the data, if the application itself, as it's executing, recognizes that the data have been maliciously modified with the intent to change the performance of the grid in an undesirable way, that application should recognize it and adjust so that the grid remains, functioning as we expect it to. So I can't speak to people, but in terms of devices, we are working that.
So at NIST, we've been thinking about the overall changes that we're seeing in what I think of as the compute platform, whether it's in operational technologies or information technologies or the combinations of both, and what kinds of technical capabilities do you need to have at play. So I think earlier, Mr. McGrath talked about cybersecurity being about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And what kinds of tools do you need to have in your tool chest, in your cybersecurity tool chest, whether you're thinking about a water sensor or you're thinking about something in financial services. At the end of the day, it's about protecting that data and what kinds of protections do you have around it, and how do you get back to providence on that? So what kinds of capabilities do you need? So looking at things like data analytics from a forward-leaning perspective, but some of our important controls that we put in place in a number of our systems today and applying those to this new kind of environment like cryptography. So we held a workshop and are doing some research on what we call lightweight cryptography, but it's really cryptography for constrained environments so that you can have that confidentiality and that integrity for the data when it comes from the sensors and it enters into the systems. And you can think about your identity management challenges, not just who I am, but again, getting back to that provenance of data, where did it start, how did it come together, from what kinds of devices, et cetera. So we're looking at a number of these sorts of capabilities to help with this problem from a technology perspective. So I'm not answering the people side either, Carol.
Let me take a shot at the people side, and Jim may have a comment on this. When you look at cyber incidents reports, a lot of the breaches start with a spear phishing attack, where some human has been fooled into clicking on a link. That's a training and cultural issue that just needs to be worked on continuously. It's mentioned in the NIST framework, but until you have been a victim of it, you don't appreciate at a gut level how sophisticated these threats can be. Jim, you mentioned that you've had some experiences. What do you do about it?
I thought you were continuing. I didn't realize that was I was going to say something similar. I'll just speak to the breach we had. I mean, phishing attacks are very sophisticated, and you can feel very crummy after one of those. It's like being robbed in your house. But to generalize a little bit more, almost everything we see has to do with lack of knowledge or having lost track of what's there. And so even within a factory, it's amazing how much, if you go talk to the CIO or the IT operations people and ask them, do you know everything that's out there? And the answer is invariably no. And if you really track it down, invariably they underestimate how much they don't know going forward. Even the breach we talked about was the result of a very little database that had been tied into a very large database that people had forgotten all about. You know, the personnel had changed, and so the entire organization didn't even know this thing existed, and so it was not kept up to date and so forth. That's actually the people side of this, and so the awareness of the, we just call it the inventory, is almost one of the first things. So from a training standpoint, yes, being aware on an individual basis, but also really taking to task, do you understand what is in your plant floor or your factory floor, wherever your domain of existence looks like. That's actually one of the most important places, I think, to start on this. If I may, I'll add one other thing to what was Carol saying. If we look forward from an institute standpoint, you now get into these trickier authentication kinds of things that you need to deal with. So we've become very, very interested in geographical authentication, you know, especially when the data can come from different sources. So it doesn't solve the problem, but it's a piece of it. But the other thing that's become interesting is right now these connections that we're talking about, no one knows how to look across them. And so if you actually have a means to look across them, put together an appropriate authentication with geographic whatever, but then have a way to look at them together, you can start seeing deviations. And then that's what I actually meant by opportunities with future technologies that we don't have today. So there's a variety of things, I think, from sensing to looking across to different ways of authentication that come to bear on this problem. But it all ultimately comes down to the people side and understanding what you have at each one of those locations.
Just to add one thing there, we talked about culture change and how important that is, and to actually get the people on board. And then after there has been an attack, the culture changing, you don't have to wait for an attack. You can do internal attacks. I had a discussion before this meeting about comparing how people were doing internal attacks in their organizations to test them. And that in itself drives a culture change, either the physical perimeter, phishing, whatever it may be, to try to get an awareness there.
People a little bit, and I want to build on that. And we see a lot of people in the manufacturing industry, not at the C-suite really, but what can we be doing on an education level or even the culture change in the company to make people more effective when they're in manufacturing and maybe cybersecurity?
I'd be happy to take that one because we have the national initiative. We work across the U.S. government to coordinate the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. And we've actually put out some different kinds of tools that can help with these sorts of questions. So we've all used the term today, cybersecurity and cybersecurity, and you can talk about cybersecurity professionals. Well, what does that really mean? What kinds of skill sets? What kinds of things, if you have an organization and you're hiring people, how do you identify the kinds of capabilities that you need? And then from the education standpoint, how do you do that marriage? So we actually came out with a second framework on workforce and education to bring those two skill sets together. And the idea behind that is there's a number of classifications that you need to consider when you think a cybersecurity professional. And sometimes cybersecurity is not my job, but it's a component of my job. So what are the skill sets that I need for that versus I'm actually a cybersecurity network engineer, and the differences between those and the different kinds of skill sets that you need. So it really focuses on that skill set piece. And again, everything that NIST does, because we're part of Department of Commerce, we're a non-regulatory agency, it's all publicly available. And actually, that piece of work, we put together some different kinds of tools so that if you're a student and you're saying, I've heard cybersecurity is where I can get a job, what does this mean for me? It takes you down a few levels in terms of areas that are of interest to you, and then the different skill sets and the different kinds of job classifications. A lot of it focuses today on sort of the government, so the Department of Defense and the civilian agencies and the way they look at cybersecurity. Our next step with that is to go much further and to have it reach out into different kinds of businesses and communities, manufacturing being one of those, getting some of that advice from financial services, et cetera. So to be able to expand on that, there's a workforce report required under the current Executive Order 13600. Did I get that right, Jeff? Jeff knows everything. He did the manufacturing profile for cybersecurity. To be able to look at this across as a national to continue to be a national priority.
I'll just also ask, we in our group, Manufacturing Industrial Base Policy, have several programs that are working workforce hard as it relates to manufacturing, right? We're on all of the White House initiatives. We are working through our Manufacturing Innovation Institutes to do a lot of workforce-related work. And I was a part of looking at legislation that was looking at really standing up more specific manufacturing-based programs. And we are very interested in skilled labor and developing the talent that we need and working with organizations that, like you mentioned. I'm not sure that we're today infusing that cybersecurity piece, but there's certainly opportunity, I think, to influence some of the curriculum work that's being done. So I'm happy to follow up with you, take a card, and kind of get you in contact with folks who are working that piece.
You know, at MForesight, we have a separate committee that looks at education workforce development as well. And in this report, one of the things we cited was the need to take what we learn and leverage existing enterprises that, so we can deploy, you know, various learnings into the manufacturing community, for example, the institutes, et cetera. But I mean, as a company, like, we do a lot of work in this space, and we stood up various early college, high school programs that are lined up with manufacturing. We've backed the P-Tech programs, et cetera. And we're in the process of kicking off what we call an experiential robotics for robotics for experiential and applied learning. And the goal is to actually bring robotics into every fourth grade classroom in the country, regardless. It's not a competition model, could lead to a competition model. So we've developed the robot, but there's an example conceptually to start even at the fourth grade level, just for kids to understand what to be aware of, right? You just plant the seed early. So I guess my point is there's a lot of opportunities, as you said, Melinda, to really kind of build this into existing curriculum. So it's one of the areas that we're, I think, positioned well to look at that. So.
NIST is hosting, the NICE folks are hosting a workshop for the second annual workshop for K through 12. I hope you have one of your folks there.
Okay, we'll talk about that. Uh-oh, now Michael's smiling. It will be fixed. There's another question there. Also, just so we know, we have the room until 4. This is slated to be over at 3:30, so we're more than happy to stick around. But go ahead.
Carol Cazenta from Siemens Corporate Technologies. I just want to echo, I think, the sentiment I heard across the panel, that collaboration really is key to really realizing the vision that I think you put forth in the report. And Dr. Hawkins mentioned SEDS, and I think that's a great example of where we're able to really tackle, as a community, the challenges of cyber, in this case, under the energy systems. And we're very pleased to be a part of your program. There's several sections there, as well as the manufacturing institutes that Department of Defense has set up. I'm wondering, what recommendations has the panel put forward as a result of your study for how to further foster this collaboration?
Say that again. What
recommendations do you have on how to increase this collaboration? And we have these challenges, we have these real major issues that cross-cut, but...
You mean more broadly with the initiative?
Yeah.
Actually, what we're planning on doing, which is one of the things that came, one of the recommendations, is actually engaging an executive level working group. One of the things that's always been difficult is to get industry involved in this discussion, and we've spent a lot of time appreciating why that's the case. We actually think that we can stand up an executive level working group from industry to actually look at the recommendations, and we'll facilitate that discussion to really chart the path forward based on the recommendations. So that's our first step that we're planning. Okay. Anyone else? With that, there's some time to network. People always like to network after the event. Well, thank you. Oh, one more.
Jack Goodman, Office of Congressman Raskin. I was just wondering, you talked about common requirements for businesses, but every business is going to be a little bit different. You know, you've got different ecosystems, different cultures. As you said, how would you go about solving that?
Mm-hmm. I can speak. Go ahead.
So were you referring to, I was talking about the sometimes parallel standardization efforts and the lack of commonality there. And in that case, they largely are working in the same space, the manufacturing space, and touching the same ground, and providing different elements to it. but by the fact that it's not a common standard, it's not a harmonized standard, it's causing a lot of difficulty for people to adopt it. So, and different businesses have different requirements. There can be different integrity levels required for different situations, but you want to take a common approach to doing that and making sure we're just not doing something different to be different. They're working together. That's the only way we get manufacturers really to adopt these things, is to simplify that approach.
Yeah, as an example, what we're doing, and we not my role at MForesight, but as Global Foundries, what we have done is taken various certifications and various ways that you can make sure that your supply chain has integrity and limit cyber risks. And we've put together a program that we work with our supply chain, all the various small and medium-sized players as well, to help to spoon feed them. Basically provide the pathway to, if you check these boxes, you're really as good as you can be right now, right? The things to look for versus having them just go online and determine, gee, what should I be looking for? What training courses are available? What certifications should I have? What am I mandated? But what is there beyond that? So what we've done is we've developed we've done that. We basically have looked out there and aggregated that and developed a playbook for our suppliers so they know how they can be as best as they can be. So to the degree that we could normalize that and provide that pathway more broadly for manufacturers in general is good.
The manufacturing profile that NIST just finalized last week, excuse me, time marches on, last week, actually takes a look at those standards and best practices and does a mapping based on those 5 high-level principles from the framework: identify what your assets are, protect those, detect, respond, and recover, so you have that resiliency in your system. And then you can see, as you step down, more of the details under something like protect, and then what are the different standards and best practices that are out there. So that's a tool that's available for manufacturers to use, and it addresses both the small, medium, and large organizations. So it gives you an opportunity to tailor what you're doing to your organization, which is from that business aspect, again, that gets back to being important, and using the framework and using the profile gives you some tool sets so you can help prioritize where you in your organization feel you need to start, and how you move through building a cybersecurity capability or increasing your cybersecurity posture.
That's a great example of how, if you look at within the Department of Commerce, you have NIST and you have the manufacturing extension partnerships, the boots on the ground that can actually take what's developed at NIST and deploy it. Do the hand-holding, deploy it, spoon-feed it out into the community. So it's not that we don't have the tools in place to disseminate information. It's we have to develop, recognize the problem, put the right stakeholders around the table, leverage the work that's been done, determine the gaps, fill the gaps, and then deploy. And we do have the tools in the tool basket, but we have to provide some incentives and get the right people around the table.
And I would say that DOD recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all solution and that everybody should just do it this way. So even in the DFARS requirement, which points to a NIST 800-171, there's choices to be made. And I think we need programs like the MEP to educate the small and mid-sized manufacturers to make them smart buyers of solutions and smart selectors and implementers of standards.
Yeah. Okay, anyone else? Okay, thanks everyone. If you want the report, just go to our website, MForesight. You can access it there. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks again to everyone.